Okay, I'm back. Comparative politics, and as promised, um, civil liberties and civil rights. That's what we're doing in this snippet. Civil liberties versus civil rights. Ooh, what's that all about? All right. So first of all, this is inside of the democracy chapters because this is something all democracies have. Some much more so than others. Um, everyone, civil rights and civil liberties, basically every country has some kind of civil rights, civil liberties issue, controversy. A lot of ways they might be similar. They might be a little bit different as well, right, from country to country. I will explain these concepts using the U.S. as an example to help us understand them, and then we can talk a little bit about how versions of these situations exist in other places, in other democracies. Um, so, civil rights and civil liberties, or every democracy is going to guarantee at least some of both of these. But what are they? Let's start with civil liberties. I think this is maybe the easiest one. It's a little bit easier to understand what a civil liberty is, in my opinion, than what a civil right is. Why? Why is that? Okay. Well, we'll see when we get to civil rights. But civil liberties are the rights that individuals have. And in the U.S.'s case, it's pretty easy to explain. Just point people to the Bill of Rights. What's in the Bill of Rights, those are civil liberties, the rights that individuals have. And what do we mean by that? Well, remember the social contract. Social contract is the theoretical agreement between a citizen and her state over what that citizen's responsibilities and duties are, and what rights and liberties do they receive in exchange for their loyalty. Okay. So everybody has them. The U.S. enshrined in the Bill of Rights. So freedom of religion, freedom to not have troops quartered by the government in your house, freedom of speech. We have the Second Amendment in the United States, the right to bear arms. So this is obviously one of the big differences between the U.S. and other democracies. Most countries don't have anything resembling our Second Amendment or the 400 gazillion guns that we have. So those are civil liberties. And sometimes you might hear them called negative liberties. And here, by negative, it's not normative, as in good or bad. We don't mean they're bad liberties. We mean negative, as in things that the government is not, that's the negative part, things that the government is not allowed to do to its citizens. So the freedom from. We'll talk about how civil rights maybe are the freedom to in a moment. But some other examples of civil liberties, what we eat, what we choose to imbibe, what we choose to drink, smoke, eat, what we choose to do in the privacy of our own homes, what we choose to say, what we choose to wear. These will all be considered freedoms because, in theory at least, they apply to all individuals. Okay? All right. Those are civil liberties. That was easy, right? Easy peasy. All right, now you tell me, what's a civil right? How do you define it? Think about that for a few seconds. Time's up. What's your answer? All right, so hopefully for a lot of you, you'll kind of get the point there. What is a civil right? How do we define it? The book defines it in certain ways. There's different ways to think about it. And not only the definition of a civil right, but how it relates to and is different than a civil liberties. If civil liberty is a right, this is the first way I want to try to explain it. If the civil liberty is a right of an individual, then a civil right is the right of a group. Aha. Okay. Civil liberties apply to all individuals. Civil rights apply to certain groups. Which groups? Everything's a group in theory. Traditionally discriminated against groups. Oftentimes minority populations. Doesn't have to be minority populations. It can be women, which are, as we all know, narrowly a majority. Rights that apply to groups, okay. Traditionally discriminated against groups. Well, think about that in terms of the U.S. The most famous, when we think of civil rights, or the civil rights movement, we know what we're talking about. The struggle for Black Americans to achieve equality, especially politically. So that's a civil rights group, a traditionally discriminated against group fighting for the rights of everybody in that group. Check. Yeah, definitely applies. So any traditionally discriminated against group. So that would include LGBTQ. That would include any ethnicity that's traditionally discriminated against. That would include and some people might put in civil liberties, but in certain situations it's certainly going to include women. So hopefully that helps a little bit to understand what we mean by civil rights. We call civil liberties negative liberties, again, not in any kind of good or bad sense. Civil rights are positive liberties. Civil liberties are the freedom from. Civil rights are the freedom to. Okay? The right to partake in all activities with all rights of any other group in a country. And you can see all countries going to have some version of this. Countries that are a little bit more homogenous, so let's say Japan, which is, famously an example that's given us of a homogenous country. They still have civil rights issues there. It's not like every single person is 100% Japanese. Of course, LGBTQ is just as relevant there as anywhere else. But there are certain other ethnicities in Japan, not just Japanese, and obviously minority groups. And you better believe it, discriminated against traditionally and currently. Those are all going to be civil rights issues. Okay. So now we're kind of getting there. That's how we think of civil rights. Remember I mentioned that they come into conflict. Oh, they shouldn't. They don't come into conflict. We can have both civil liberties and civil rights, and we do in the United States. 93% of American history involves a struggle between civil rights and civil liberties. So forget that stuff about how, we got them all. We got them both. No. A lot of the things that we fought over traditionally, maybe not 93%, but a lot of things that we fought over traditionally have been this tension between civil rights and civil liberties. Oh, give me an example. All right, the Civil War. How about that? Is that good enough for you? Is that important enough for you? That was 100% a clash between civil rights and civil liberties. Come on. In what way were there civil liberties involved? We get the civil rights part, right? Don't give me any of that. Just as a slight aside here, any of that. The Civil War was not about slavery. It was about secession and preserving the Union. And Lincoln didn't want to end slavery. He just wanted to keep the Union together. True. But why was the South seceding in the first place? Because Lincoln had been elected. Why? What did that mean to them? That meant that days of slavery were numbered. How do we know that? Because Lincoln consistently said it and made it clear that there would be no new slave states allowed entry into the United States. And that was a death knell for slavery. And slave owners knew it. It might have taken 10 years, it might have taken 100 years, but slave owners viewed slavery as a superior system to anything else out there, and they damn well intended to keep it going for as long as they could. Into perpetuity. Some were true believers that it was a better system. This was a civil liberties issue for them. It's weird to look at it this way, but they truly believe that they were fighting for freedom. What kind of freedom? They were fighting for liberty. The liberty for them to do what they wanted with their own property. Oh, yes. Well, that's what they believed, right? They were wrong. I mean, morally and all of that, I think historically, the vast majority of people are going to look at that and say, oh, yeah, they were definitely wrong. But they also definitely believed that they were fighting for liberty. And that would have been a civil liberty to do what they wanted to have the business that they wanted to have, to own who they wanted to own, etc., etc. They viewed that as a property issue. And that's where it clashed with civil rights. Okay, that's an extreme example. Do we have anything more recently? Because the United States has improved, and so have a lot of other countries. Yes, LGBTQ are that's civil rights issues, and they come into conflict with civil liberties issues on a fairly regular basis. How so? Well, we've seen all these cases popping up about adhering to existing LGBTQ related civil rights legislation, whether it's nationally or whether it's on a state level in the United States, violates some person's freedom of religion. You want to you bake cakes for a living, and you're a Christian, and you only want to do Christian weddings. To you, that you can make the argument to you that that's a violation of your freedom of religion, and that's the case being made in the courts in the United States, and this is not a settled issue yet. Whether or not, with the new 6-3 Supreme Court, presumably they will come down on the side of freedom of religion. So, that's a clash between civil rights and civil liberties. And I think most of you have very strong feelings about this one way or the other, but I want you to think of it in those terms, which is probably a new way to think of it. But it's accurate, and I think it's useful. Or you might argue, that's just such a crap reason. Well, I think that to deny people their rights as individuals, or that's a wrong interpretation of religion, or this or that. You can make all those arguments, but the religious people saying they don't want to do that are making a civil liberties argument. It's not the first time it's happened with the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Act, 1965. You can no longer, among other things, public businesses that are open to the public can no longer discriminate based on race, religion, sex. There's a category of groups that are considered privileged, and race is one of them. So if you own a barbecue joint in Oklahoma, you are not allowed to serve whites only. Did they just roll over and play dead all of a sudden agree with it? All these racist barbecue owners who didn't want to serve black people? No, they took it through the court system. They made a legal argument. What was the legal argument? Their civil liberties were being violated. Maybe they said it was their religion based on this quote from this or that quote from the Bible. Maybe they said it was their right just as a business person to run a business the way they saw fit. But for them, that's a civil liberty issue. And the civil rights side won out on that. are still conservatives who are opposed to the Civil Rights Act based upon this idea that people should have the freedom to do what they want with their businesses. So, that shows you how they can be fully in conflict. And a lot of our controversies, when you think about it in this fashion, from this angle, they're applicable, right? Some of the really white hot button pushing movements that get people into the voting booths and keep them motivated, or exactly this kind of stuff. How about let's see, freedom of speech, civil liberties versus civil rights. What about the Ku Klux Klan marching and holding a rally in a city? The Ku Klux Klan, until recently, was always supported by the ACLU in their efforts to peacefully march in public. Freedom of speech, First Amendment. What does the ACLU stand for? American Civil Liberties Union. Post Charlottesville, I will note that the ACLU has stopped doing this. They no longer go to court to defend the Klan's right or any white supremacist group's right to speak in public. They just decided, I think they understand that's still civil liberty, but they decided, nah, we're not going to do it anymore. That's a civil liberty versus the civil right, the right to not be threatened by these groups that were traditionally protected by the powerful, and of course were violent and terrorist. See you in chapter 7, Ku Klux Klan. So that's another example of it, this idea of free speech versus people's right to live without fear, right? A group of people's right to live with the same security and safety as everybody else. The people's right to live in a country that has truly gotten past its history. Okay, so these are kind of things you see in other countries that pop up. Freedom of speech is different in every country. The United States and other classically liberal countries tend to have stronger protections for speech than other political economic systems. Generally, not always, but there's definitely countries where you have less freedom of speech than the U.S. They're still fully democracies. In Germany, they have famously banned many things related to the Holocaust, the publication of Mein Kampf, owning and distributing Nazi memorabilia, things like this. It's quite a bit different than here, right? You can totally see why they did it. So these laws will depend on the beliefs and systems and the cultures and the histories and different of wherever you are. So that's just one example. The rights of non-Japanese. I'll give you an example from when I lived there. I lived there for about 4 years, and one of the interesting things was, at the time, this is before the internet, basically before the internet. So there was this book, I think it was called Apato, which is a Japanese word for apartment, and it was kind of like the phone book, but it was produced either weekly or monthly. I think it might have been weekly, and you could buy it anywhere. You can buy it in 7-Elevens and train stations, and it's where everybody went if you were looking for an apartment, townhouse, condo, whatever. Not to buy, but to rent. If you wanted to rent an apartment, that's where you went. and it doesn't matter if you're Japanese or if you're a foreigner, that sort of thing. That's the book you get to see what's available, and it tells you, okay, how much sunlight does it get, how many bamboo tatami mats it has, how big it is, and how many minutes of a walk is it to which train station. All the important stuff. So it was quite common if you pick that up, and I was in need of looking for apartments during my 4.5 years on a couple different occasions, so I would pick up that and leaf through it in the areas that I wanted to live in, and it was fairly common to see in an ad, just stuck in there, no gaijin. Gaijin meaning kind of slightly rude word for foreigner. That would, for civil rights reasons, be fully illegal in the United States, but it was open illegal in protected speech in Japan. Very different culture, very different history, very different system, but that's what comparative politics is. This one's gone rather long, so I'm going to leave it at that. I am going to, this is the last one for today. I'll be back in the next day or so. Once again, still on the topic of democracies. So until then, ciao.